to ACF Chefs Forum. Now, more than ever, it's important for culinarians to connect, to share, and to offer inspiration and mentorship, which is exactly why we're excited to have experts here with information just for you, the leaders and future leaders of the food service industry. I'm Jackie Pressinger, American Culinary Federation's Director of Strategic Partnerships, and on behalf of ACF and one of our newest association partners, the Collegiate and Professional Sports Dietitians Association, as well as the IMBAS Foundation, and of course, University of Montana, we are delighted to welcome you to today's very special presentation highlighting nutrition as we celebrate two very important dates in October, International Chef's Day, as well as Childhood Nutrition Day. So today we'll be covering both how you can enhance your performance as a chef via nutrition, and how you'll be able to influence positive change in the health of our country, and how it actually starts with what we put on our plates. And now I'd like to welcome Robert Penry, ACF's Culinary Programs Project Administrator, to say a few words about ACF's efforts to support the health of our nation, customers, and families, as well as Childhood Nutrition Day. Thank you, Robert.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today as we prepare to celebrate Childhood Nutrition Day on October 16th and promote healthy eating habits throughout the month of October. As many of you may know, childhood obesity has increased dramatically over the past several decades, and currently about 1/3 of all youth aged 2 to 19 are considered overweight or obese. Partnering with World Chefs since the campaign launched in 1995, ACF is committed to continue bringing awareness to this very important issue. Whether it's hosting an event in your local community, holding a virtual healthy cooking demonstration, or mentoring a local school, each of you can certainly make a difference. ACF is actually proud to offer healthy eating grants twice yearly. You can find information on this on our website and to apply, as well as many more resources. We hope that this edition of Chefs Forum will inspire you with lots of great ideas so that together we can help continue bringing awareness to this issue. Also, for those of you tuning in for today's program, we invite you to participate. Today, we will be taking questions for our featured guest presenters. Please be sure to use the chat function to collaborate with the other chefs and students joining us today, and the Q&A function to pose your questions for our presenters. All right, let's go ahead and get the discussion going in the chat. Please let us know where you're tuning in from today. While you're putting that in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you again and pass it back to Jackie.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Robert. So let's get into our presentation. We are overjoyed to have two fantastic guests with us today. First, we'll hear from Stephanie Miezin. She is a registered dietitian and certified specialist in sports dietetics with experience in both dietetics and culinary arts, and serves as the director of nutrition at Canyon Ranch, a health and performance-focused resort organization. She has a bachelor's in culinary nutrition from Johnson & Wales University and a master's in medical dietetics from Ohio State, and is a member of CPSDA. Stephanie started out working in both front of the back of the house in various restaurants and food service operations, and she has worked with the US OPC fueling team, USA athletes by coordinating performance nutrition recipes and menus at Olympic and Pan American Games, and also at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center in Colorado. She has also helped fuel athletes in the Tampa Bay Rays baseball organization, Ohio State University, and international soccer athletes. Following her presentation, we'll introduce you to Chef Dr. Mike Fenster, a cardiologist, professor, chef, author, and storyteller. But at this time, I'd like to welcome Stephanie to kick us off with her presentation.
Hey, thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, everybody, for having me. I'm really excited to be able to talk about some of these really fun topics that I think are super impactful. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay. Hopefully that's good.
Yes, looks great.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome. Okay, so I would love to take my time today to share how I think about combining both our chef point of view and our nutrition point of view for creating healthful and delicious plates. This delicious concept is a really, really important one here. Sometimes when we think about healthy food, we don't necessarily think that it is delicious, but I think a really important way that we can make this happen and have people eat in a more healthful manner, it's got to be delicious, right? We know taste is probably the #1 thing that drives behaviors, and so that is a key component of this whole conversation. So if we're thinking about building healthful, delicious plates, we can first start to think about this in terms of, if we're wearing our chef's hat, what are we thinking about? What are we trying to put on that plate, right? So in a culinary approach, we perhaps might be first focused on flavor, right? Flavor development, super flavorful ingredients, seasonality. How are we combining different flavors, right? If we are marinating this fish with some savory, kind of funky fish sauce, how can we balance that out with some other herbs or other components on the plate, right? We also might be thinking about recreating or reimagining a dish that we know really connects with people. And of course, we're thinking about, who are we cooking for? What do they like? What is the seasonality of this? How does this dish fit into their environment, right? And so those are some of the things that we might be thinking about if we are really talking about building a plate from a more culinary approach. And there is some overlap when it comes to building a plate from a nutrition approach, but it's not quite the same, of course, right? So if we're talking about building a plate that's balanced, delicious, healthful from a nutrition approach, we perhaps are first going to be focused on, what is the goal of the individual or the individuals that we are creating this plate or this meal for? Specific to performance nutrition, are we talking about perhaps body composition goals? Are we talking about fueling up for a competition or recovering from a competition or training? Those would be some examples that we might consider in terms of goals around creating a plate. And then from there, we would start to think about, okay, what is the macronutrient content of this plate? Are there certain micronutrient needs that we need to be focusing on for this person or group of individuals? And then timing too, right? So is it before they're about to train or exercise or afterwards? That might affect what types of foods we put on the plate, in addition to the portions. Of course, with nutrition, we're also thinking about, who is this food for? What are their preferences? So you can see there is some overlap, but there's also two pretty different approaches at coming at this balanced plate. I think when we're talking about healthful and delicious, we really have to kind of wear both of these hats at once and try to understand both sides here. So one of the ways that we can start thinking about that is with the basic components of a balanced plate, right? And we could pretty much sum that up with protein, starches, and our vegetables, right? If we are thinking from a chef's point of view, those might be the main components that we would think about putting onto a dish that we might consider an entree. And if we're thinking about a nutrition point of view or a dietitian's point of view, those would likely be the same components that we're thinking about for balance. So let's take this to the next level now and say, okay, we have these components, but what does that mean for balance on the plate? And so we can start to think about this idea, right? General, healthful, balanced eating plate. We have our proteins, we have our starches, we have our veggies and our fruits. Now, in terms of components of ratios here, this balanced plate has about 50% veggies and fruits, about 25% protein foods, and about 25% starches. We're going to get into how this might be adjusted based on goals, but this is a really good foundation to think about. This is very much in line with the government My Plate, which came out several years ago to replace the pyramid idea in terms of guiding people to eat healthfully. So we know from a culinary point of view, right, those starches on the plate make us feel full. They give us, that satisfaction of eating. Those proteins end up kind of being the star of the show. We put so much time and effort in, really developing flavors on those components of the dish. And the veggies and fruits, those give freshness, those give color to the plate. And if we're thinking about it from a nutrition point of view, that stuff is definitely still true and applies, but there is some more perhaps intentionality behind the benefit nutritionally that we would get from each of these components. We can start to think about that way. So for our starches, we know that these are really important for baseline essential energy. There's a lot of information out there right now, basically saying that carbohydrates are inherently bad for us. I would say that's not necessarily supported by research and specific to performance nutrition. You could definitely argue that carbohydrates are an important part of a performance plate. So carbohydrates provide essential energy for us, both brain and body. So if somebody is not getting enough carbohydrate throughout the day, there is a decent chance that they're going to be pretty low energy, hard to focus. And this totally applies to us in the kitchen as well. When you're running around all day, carrying the giant cambros of chicken and whatever else it might be, you need some energy to keep going. And carbohydrate plays a really key role in doing that. So when we're choosing carbohydrate foods, we generally want these to be higher in fiber. That is going to be important for foundational health, supporting gut health, supporting satiety, blood glucose regulation, decreasing risk of disease over time, etc. Types of foods that we're talking about in this area include many whole grains like whole wheat, quinoa, brown rice, wild rice, oats, things of that nature, corn, peas, beans, potatoes and sweet potatoes. All these types of things are going to fit into this starches category. For our proteins, from a nutrition point of view, we know that our proteins are really important for us to feel satisfied. They take a while to be digested as a macronutrient, protein. These are really important for a foundationally healthy and strong body. We know that protein, of course, is important for muscle, but it's important as every cell in our body is made up of protein to some degree there too. So really important for good foundational health. When we're choosing protein foods, we generally want them to be leaner. This is especially important for land-based animal proteins. When they have fats, it tends to be higher in saturated fat. Too much saturated fat over time is likely not ideal for heart health. So we want to be focusing mostly on lean animal-based proteins from the land. And of course, seafood, excellent protein source. And when they have fats, it tends to be richer in unsaturated fats, specifically omega-3s. So those are really helpful as well. Our soy foods are an excellent source of high quality protein. Our eggs, dairy, perhaps low-fat dairy, we might want to lean towards. And then of course, our plant-based proteins, such as beans and nuts and seeds, those do provide protein in the diet. We just have to be aware that they perhaps might have more carbohydrate or more fats than protein. And so we would have to think about balancing that out to make sure that we're still getting, good ratios of macronutrients on the plate. This last component here are fruits and vegetables. These are essential for good foundational health. They provide essential vitamins, antioxidants, fiber again. And when we're choosing these guys, we really kind of want to eat the rainbow. It's a little cliche, but there's really a lot to it. All of those colors are representative of different types of antioxidants, essentially, that can help promote our own health in many different ways. So a variety of colors of fruits and vegetables is probably the best way to think about this plate versus any one specific type. The last component of a balanced plate is not specifically shown on here, but still really important. That's going to be our fats. So we know that we need some fats in our diet for good health. These are important for long-lasting energy, hormone production, absorption of certain vitamins. When we're choosing these fats, we want them to be mostly unsaturated for good overall health, including heart health and brain health. Rule of thumb here is choosing mostly plant sources of fats, with the exception of our tropical oils. So coconut and palm, these are actually very high in saturated fat. So it doesn't mean they're in no food, but it means something that, we probably want to be a little bit more moderate with intake of those if we're trying to support overall health. Okay, so we have this plate. We kind of understand the purpose of each of these components. Now we can start thinking about what does this mean if we're trying to fuel different needs, right? And so we can translate this plate into this simple kind of framework for thinking about it, right? So this plate has a quarter of it with our starches as that lightning bolt to signify that is where we're getting energy from. Quarter of the plate as that arm, so strength, protein is kind of representative of helping us have a strong body. And then the half of the plate with the heart and the cross, this is signifying more or less that this is really important for foundational health and protecting us. So we're going to dive real quick into a little bit of performance nutrition here to help understand how we might adjust this plate based on different needs. So this plate as is perhaps most applicable for what we might say is a light training day. This is generally categorized as up to about 1 hour or so of physical activity per day. And this is because of the amount of carbohydrate on there. It's important, right, to come back to this idea that carbs are a main source of energy. And so if we are being more active, then we might want to bring in more carbohydrate to fuel that activity, right? And so this plate wouldn't be the same, right? If you were going to the gym, for an hour a day, your plate would look different than if somebody, who's going to go cycling for 3 or 4 hours, right? So we can think about changing the ratios of this plate based on activity level. This is, we're talking about this in terms of time, so the duration, but the intensity of this activity is important here too. But just to talk about time here, that light training plate is on the left here. That's what we were originally talking about with that balanced plate. If you are doing moderate training, so maybe going 1 to 2 hours of activity, we might want to push carbohydrate to be a little bit more than 25% to help better meet your energy needs. And we know that we are using a lot of carbs to be active, and so we want to bring that in on the front end in terms of intake to match the output. So we have carbohydrate is a little bit more on the plate. We are slightly decreasing the veggie and fruit section to make room for that, but don't worry, we're still getting those guys in. And then if we're talking about hard training, so 3 to 4+ hours of being active, this is where maybe even 50% of the plate would become carbohydrate foods to help fuel that activity. You can see protein doesn't change. This is a really key thing. I hear a lot of times people say, oh, I'm going to the gym, so I need to eat more protein. Well, maybe it depends where you're starting baseline. Protein doesn't really change because it doesn't really give us energy in the way that carbs and fats do. So protein stays about 25% of this general balanced plate. So as chefs, there's a lot of activity, right, in this role. And so if you are walking around for 12, 14 hours a day, carrying heavy things, constantly moving, then you might argue that this light training day plate might not be enough for you, considering that level of activity. So just something to reflect on as you think about your meals and your meal composition, fueling yourself so you can maintain good energy, but also, thinking about who you're serving. If they are less active or more active, that might influence what we're putting on the plate and the proportions of those foods. So the last thing I just want to touch on here is, how do we sell this stuff? So selling health, right? We all know that eating more healthful foods in more balanced patterns is going to be better for us. But we also know that that is not what really, determines our decisions. In the moment, our decisions on food are largely based on taste and flavor. And so we need to leverage that. And this is where it kind of comes full circle to put that chef hat back on. So we could talk about this plate with this description, right? It's beef with mixed vegetables and potato wedges. That's accurate. That's not wrong. But is that really going to help sell that plate once you put so much effort into making it taste amazing, but also having it be really balanced and rich in nutrients? Instead, we could think about a little bit more of a descriptive, description here. So instead of beef with mixed vegetables and potato wedges, maybe it's charbroiled tri-tip steak with herb marinated tomatoes, garlicky sauteed snap peas and baby spinach, and Southwest spice crusted steak fries. That sounds a whole lot better, at least to me, than that first description. So this really matters. This affects ordering, even for the same food. There's actually some really interesting research in this area showing that this is truly the case. So if we're trying to combine all these ideas, delicious plates, really healthful, balanced, great source of nutrition, and we're trying to sell it to people, we need to focus on flavor. That's really going to help to get this into their mouths, right, into their body to help them. It's one thing to talk about this stuff, but it's another thing to really make it happen. So we need to keep focusing on developing flavor, understanding the components of the plate and the balance, and then wrap it up by really selling it to people, focusing on flavor. Okay, that is all I have, and I will pass it back to you, Jackie.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Really great information. And you're so right. Working in the kitchen can be a really physical job. So eating for proper or peak performance definitely is helpful for all of us. We've received some questions from the audience. Please continue to enter those into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to all of your questions for Stephanie following Dr. Mike's presentation. So now we will hear from a longtime ACF member, Dr. Michael Fenster Md, better known as Chef Dr. Mike, is one of only a handful of physicians worldwide to hold both culinary and medical degrees, and is the only interventional cardiologist and professional chef to do so. He is also the only cardiologist with joint academic appointments in both medical and culinary arts, serving as professor of culinary medicine at the University of Montana. He has many accolades and TV appearances, including as host of the PBS show House Calls with Chef Dr. Mike. However, in the interest of time, I've had to shorten his list of accomplishments, but I do want to underscore that his mission is clear and his message serves to empower people to take control of their health, wellness, and happiness through a positive relationship with food. So thank you so much for being with us today. Chef Dr. Mike, I know we're going to learn a little bit more about childhood nutrition. At this time, I'm going to pass the presentation over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Stephanie. That was a great presentation. So if somebody can let me know that now you should be able to see the screen.
Yes,
Jackie?
Chef.
Okay, great. Okay, so yes, welcome. Thank you. I am Dr. Michael Fenster. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here today at the University of Montana. We're delighted to be part of this program in association with the Imbas Foundation, the CPSDA, and of course, our friends and colleagues at the American Culinary Federation. Today, in recognition and support of International Children's Nutrition Day, which occurs during the month of October, I'd like to talk with you about the role of culinary medicine in children's health. And as mentioned, please feel free to have any questions you have in the chat, and we'll certainly all do our best to get to those at the end of the presentation. So let's cut right to the chase. What's wrong with a little snack or occasional treat, especially for a child? After all, we can all probably remember just such a happenstance when we were kids. For many, if not most of us, such memories bring a smile to our face and maybe even a tear to our eyes. And the short answer is that as an occasional treat, nothing is wrong with a little special snack. I think we can agree that all in all, kids are pretty resilient, but there is a flip side. Because I think we can also all agree that the trauma and scars of childhood can run quite deep. They can shape us in ways we don't recognize at the time and may not even fully appreciate until many decades later, if we diagnose their presence at all. Hidden from conscious view, they may affect our health and wellness as adults in a myriad of ways. When it comes to sharing our relationship with food, that first starts when we bond with our mothers over breast or bottle. And that relationship with food will develop and change and grow from every single encounter. Every meal of every day of our lives molds us in body, mind, and spirit in one fashion or another, both consciously and unconsciously. Those meals will impact our health and wellness. But they will also resonate throughout society because they affect not only the individual, but collectively the health of a generation. And this can weigh heavily upon the public health burdens of an entire nation. And when the danger of poor choices is unrecognized or ignored, that course may be charted with the very best of intentions, but it will lead us to the most disastrous of outcomes. So in terms of culinary medicine, we're going to take a closer look at what we put on the plates of our children. Specifically, the relationship between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and children's health. Which brings us to our first question today. What are ultra-processed foods? In our culinary medicine approach, we use a definition based on the NOVA system. Nova was created as a new way to analyze and categorize food. It was developed by Professor Monteiro and colleagues at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil just over a decade ago. This system has been adopted by the United Nations and many countries worldwide and is currently the global gold standard used in research studies. Nova, unlike many nutrient-centric and other insufficient classification systems that remain mainstream methodology, Nova views food from a different perspective. That is the degree of processing. Within the Nova classification, there are 4 groups. Nova Group 1, raw and unprocessed foods like raw milk. Nova Group 2, minimally processed foods and culinary ingredients like butter. Nova Group 3, processed foods like a from-scratch classic pizza napoletana. And then there is Nova Group 4, ultra processed foods. And these Group 4 foods are a different beast altogether. Never in the history of the human species have we consumed so many products not found in the natural world. For the purposes of discussion today, and in general, we need only focus on a binary choice. Is it a Nova Group 4 ultra-processed food or not? As it is evident here, when we apply the lens of culinary medicine and Nova classification to separate the ultra-processed from the non-ultra-processed, we view food in a whole new way. A pizza is no longer a pizza. A sandwich is no longer simply a sandwich. And a burger is no longer a burger. And when a sandwich is no longer a sandwich, and when a burger is no longer a burger, we must make a shift. Ultra-processed foods are unique. There are several defining characteristics that distinguish ultra-processed foods, or UPFs. The first is that the naturally occurring food matrix is substantially degraded or destroyed. The second is that in reassembling the matrix and the production of ultra-processed foods, there are added compounds not found in nature and of rare culinary use. These additives and preservatives are known as markers of ultra-processing, or MUPs. Another characteristic of ultra-processed foods is that they often have excessive amounts of undesirable sugars, salt, and fats added to their preparation. This threesome is often added to ultra-processed foods in an effort to maximize their bliss point. The bliss point is a term used to describe the combinations of sugar, salt, and fat that deliver the maximum pleasure before a particular food is perceived as unpleasant. And these ratios may vary depending upon the type of food. For example, we might prefer a potato chip to be saltier and a donut to be sweeter. Ultra-processed foods are manipulated to achieve the maximum bliss point, and thus their characteristic hyperpalatability by adding maximum levels of sugars, salt, and fats. All 3 of these food components, sugar, salt, and fat, act via dopamine in the reward center of our brain in a way similar to opiate medications. And hey, this country's done a great job with that so far, haven't we? The result when it comes to food is that authentic, wholesome foods, things like fruits and vegetables, get displaced from our tables. So instead of real foods, we end up consuming collections of manufactured compounds that our bodies and our gut bacteria, so essential for health, have never experienced before. In addition to their defining characteristics, ultra-processed foods also have a pair of associated properties. The first is that because they are very profitable, they are also very aggressively marketed. These offerings are often aimed to appeal to our desire for convenience. In fact, although people often say otherwise, research has shown that people will purchase the food they consider less tasty and even pay more simply because it is more convenient. These campaigns are also often directed at children, the most vulnerable among us, with the goal of developing brand loyalty at as young an age as possible. Given that, it's not surprising that behind much of the advertising to children are very large multinational food corporations. Within their economic practice, we see a lack of any efforts aimed at protecting the youngest members of our society through emphasizing responsible consumption. Because of their economic clout, we also see a lack of legislative regulation to protect children from such advertising, coupled with a lack of effort to encourage children to consume healthy food. In this way, what certain food companies are doing is educating children on the consumption of their products, so that later, as teenagers and adults, they will have these ingrained behavior patterns of food and beverage purchasing and consumption. And we could see that corporate influence reflected in governmental food guidelines, of which only 7 countries in the entire world even mention ultra-processed food directly in their guidelines. 4 are in South America, and the list does not include the United States. In addition to making ultra-processed items as accessible as possible, these comestibles are often priced in a manner that makes them significantly less expensive compared to more nutritionally dense, natural whole foods. The end result is that once again, real foods get displaced from our table. So to review the characteristics of ultra-processed foods as defined in the practice of culinary medicine, they are comestibles in which the natural food matrix has been substantially degraded or destroyed. There are added compounds not found in nature. There are excessive amounts of added sugars, fats, and salt. The goal of their construction is to make them addictive or hyper-palatable and profitable. And they are aggressively marketed and made to be inexpensive to the consumer, thereby displacing real, wholesome foods from our table. What are the impacts of such UPF consumption on children? How do these manufactured creations affect life at the stages of greatest biological vulnerability? It actually starts before we're even born. Now, we've long known that maternal diet has tremendous impacts on the fetus. What we are learning is that maternal diets loaded with UPFs can have negative consequences before the baby's even seen a Frito corn chip. Maternal consumption of UPFs in the first trimester correlated with reduced fetal growth. A 10% increase in UPF consumption results in measurable reduction in fetal growth. It's a phenomenon that's similar to that seen in women who smoke during pregnancy. Paradoxically, increased UPF consumption is associated with weight gain in the mother and an increased risk of gestational diabetes in the third trimester. A recent US study showed that maternal consumption of UPFs during pregnancy increased the risk of the child becoming obese during childhood by over 25%. In another study, the maternal tertile consuming the most UPFs translated into a significantly increased risk of depression for the new mother. A Norwegian study correlated UPF consumption in the mother with an increased risk of ADHD symptoms in their children manifesting by age 8. And this finding is supported by a recent Spanish study that found that increased maternal consumption of UPFs during pregnancy affected verbal functioning in early childhood. And verbal functioning is an important cognitive domain of subsequent neurodevelopment. In lactating women, a study showed the relationship between UPF consumption and breast milk composition. Greater consumption of UPFs was associated with lower levels of things like important vitamins. UPF consumption also correlated to an increased risk of inflammation as evidenced by elevated biomarkers. It also, remarkably, seems to impact the eating practices of young children as well. There is an inverse relationship between UPF introduction and the duration of continued breastfeeding and healthy food introduction. In other words, Children who breastfed less than 180 days have an increased risk of being introduced to UPFs at a very early age. A study of foods produced specifically for toddlers in Australia found that over 85% of those foods were ultra-processed. Consumption of these UPFs was linked to increased concentration of phthalates and bisphenol F. Phthalate and bisphenol are chemicals present in materials such as plastic, paper, and metal that are used in food packaging and are associated with a number of future health risks. Studies have also shown that greater consumption of UPFs correlates directly with an increased risk of childhood obesity. From age 2 to 4, increased ultra-processed food consumption correlates directly with increased weight, as reflected in an increased BMI and decreased growth. Quite simply, when kids eat ultra-processed foods, they wind up short and fat. And obesity tracks from childhood right into adulthood. Quite simply and depressingly, early onset obesity is a risk factor for dying young. It increases the rates of diabetes, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, cerebrovascular disease, certain cancers, hip fracture, and other joint problems. It also has devastating psychosocial consequences that persist into adulthood. Today, the data shows us that by age five, ultra-processed foods will form almost 70% of the average young American's diet. And after age 5, as kids head off to school, the assault continues. A British study found that in both primary and secondary schools, the meals children ate at school were likewise over 70% ultra-processed foods. That analysis, unfortunately, included packed lunches from home. So where does this leave our future? It leaves us on the precipice. Diets high in UPFs correlate to an increased risk of many of the chronic disabilities and diseases that plague us today. Consumption of UPFs correlates with the risk of developing illnesses like obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even an increased risk of early death. And this link between these conditions and the risk of early death persists even when we adjust for all other known risk factors. And clearly, as we have discussed, this risk is starting at an earlier and earlier age, even potentially while we are still in the womb, with the increasing prevalence of ultra-processed foods as the majority component of our diet. By the year 2060, just a few decades away, as those younger generations begin to age after a lifetime of ultra-processed food consumption, the projected rates of cardiovascular risk factors and disease will increase significantly in the United States, according to a study published recently in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Among the general U.S. population, all 4 cardiometabolic risk factors are expected to increase over the next several decades with devastating implications. Type 2 diabetes is expected to increase by almost 40% to 55 million persons. Dyslipidemia is expected to increase by almost 30% to 126 million persons. Hypertension is expected to increase by over 25% to 162 million persons. And obesity is expected to increase by almost 20% to 126 million persons. The result is an over 30% increase in the number of strokes to 15 million, an over 30% increase in those suffering with heart failure to 13 million, an additional over 30% increase in those suffering from ischemic heart disease to 29 million, and an almost 20% increase in the number of heart attacks to 16 million. So, confronted with this, what can we do? Well, we could start by building a positive food experience founded on culinary medicine principles. Let's start by sourcing and serving real and authentic food. As Stephanie so brilliantly put, let's make sure we craft those into delicious meals, including things like pizza, from those said ingredients. Let's involve our children in the culinary process, all the way from sourcing to serving. and let's eat. Maybe we can't do it all the time in our crazy 24/7 on the go world, but at least take some moments of each day to eat with purpose and not mindlessly. And perhaps most important, altogether, we must not forget to play with our food and have some fun. A meal should always be an opportunity to share authentic joy through authentic ingredients. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'm going to stop the share and turn on the video.
There you are. There you are. Well, thank you so much. I mean, really a powerful message, and we appreciate it very, very much. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we may not be able to address all of them, but I'm trying to curate these as best as possible. And then Stephanie, are you back on camera as well, so that some of these questions may be best answered by you as well? So for those of you who are also asking, yes, you will receive the recording. We will email it to you shortly so that you can review and hopefully share with your colleagues as well. So the first question, I will kind of just throw it out there to either of you who might want to answer. One of the chefs is wondering, is organic important and better for you? So I'm sure you might both have something to chime in on. Chef Dr. Mike, you're on my screen right now, so I didn't know if you might want to take that question first.
Sure, it does. It matters a lot, particularly, as we talked about, and I touched on some of these additives, some which seem to make their way in from food packaging. Remember, again, what I was speaking about in terms of ultra processed food, those foods are made to be shelf stable, sit on the shelf a long time. So a lot of those things can work their way into food. Organic food, in some studies, has been shown obviously to have less pesticides, so less things added to it, but also be higher in nutrient content as well. And one study that was done, an international study, found that organic foods may equal 2 to 3 servings of conventional fruits and vegetables in terms of the punch that they pack. And also, I would add that as a sort of a separate thing that we could do, some of these additives like Roundup have been shown to affect the endocrine system in very negative ways. So all in all, I know not everybody can afford it, but when people can, and when people can source it, and when you know the producers as a chef and you know where your food comes from, you can bring it to your customers, and it doesn't have to necessarily carry the organic label, just knowing that it was raised that way, because certainly a lot of our small producers in Montana can't afford to go through the certification process, but they actually exceed what it would take to be to receive that kind of labeling. So that's my 2 cents on it. I'll kick it over to Stephanie.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. I will say I try to enter this conversation understanding that there's a lot of nuance here. And there is publicly available data on, tested by the USDA every year on conventional and organic produce, both domestically and internationally grown. It's a publicly available, very boring, huge report that we can all look at. I would say the good news is that through that report, we generally do see that pesticide and insecticide content of both organic and conventionally grown foods is extremely low. So we do have that. With that said, if people feel more comfortable choosing organic, of course, I think more than anything, it is a really personal decision. I try to just think about some research that we have that says if people think that organic is the only way to go, then they tend to eat less fruits and vegetables, and that's obviously not what we want, right? So I think there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and I try to gauge where someone's at, what's feasible for them to do, and what their priorities really are.
Excellent points, both of you. Thank you very much. Stephanie, while you're on the screen, I'll ask this next question. One of the chefs tuning in was wondering, if carbs produce energy, then what do the proteins provide?
Yeah, really good question. So all of our macronutrients, carbs, proteins, and fats, and actually alcohol is another macronutrient that we didn't really cover, but these all have calories, right, which is a measure of energy. Carbohydrates and fats are our main source of energy in terms of fuel usage for the body, right? So even though protein has calories, it takes a lot more energy for the body to break down protein, and so we're expending fuel, we're expending energy in that way. Also, if we look at fuel usage, whether you are sitting or sprinting, you're getting very, very little energy from protein in terms of fuel. So yes, we are getting some energy from protein, but truly protein is there as a signaling molecule, specifically when we're talking about rebuilding muscle and repairing muscle, but also providing the building blocks via little amino acids that make up those protein molecules to repair all cells. So yes, they have calories, but especially when it comes to protein, it goes way beyond just the energy density of those foods, because there's a lot that it's doing, mechanistically in terms of like building a strong body. If that answers the question.
I think so. Absolutely. Anything you wanted to add, Chef Dr. Mike, or?
Nope, I think Stephanie nailed that one.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So the next one is, how do you feel about factory produced meat analogs versus other vegan protein options like tofu or tempeh when it comes to health and nutritional benefits? I see Stephanie shaking her head. So if you wanted to take that one first, feel free, and then we'll come to Chef Dr. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, with any answer in nutrition, my answer is kind of like, it depends. If that's the only way somebody can get protein in, okay, right? And also what is the alternative, right? We know that there's a lot of like very highly processed foods, like Chef Dr. Mike was talking about, that are probably not the best to have, especially frequently in our diet, right? I think for me, a lot of this comes down to frequency. Magnitude of impact wise, when it comes to dietary choices, it's really all about frequency and long-term dietary patterns. So if somebody's only way to get in protein was through an ultra processed food that happened to be plant-based, I might work with them and say, okay, like, is there anything else that we can, try to get in there that might be more of a whole food that would perhaps have a more natural food matrix or something like that. But I'm hesitant to say that it's inherently bad in all scenarios, because I think it really depends. To your point, I think sometimes that we hear these messages around, if it's plant-based, it's inherently better. That's not always the case, right? To what Chef Dr. Mike was talking about, we have to talk about, what is that food? How is it produced? It's not just this overall plant or animal label. There's a lot more to the story there.
So I'll pick up on that. That was a perfect toss there, Stephanie. Thank you. Because I'll come out a little bit more vociferously on that. We know nothing really about the long-term effects of a lot of these plant-based meat alternatives. They have novel protein. Soy hemagglutinin has never been consumed by human beings in the amounts that are in these packages. So we have no idea what they are. And I want to emphasize, what Stephanie said, because I think so many people are jumping that I've talked to on the bandwagon, thinking, one, they're doing something better for themselves because it says plant-based, and two, they're also feeling good because it's like, I'm helping the environment, I'm doing something for the planet because it's plant-based. And as Stephanie said, it's a much more nuanced conversation into how we get to these proteins and how they're produced. Monocrop agriculture versus regenerative agriculture with real meat, for example, is a whole nother conversation. So my short answer is that, we just don't know. And looking at the level of ultra processing, I can tell you that they are amongst the most ultra processed of ultra processed foods, which kind of makes sense if you're trying to take something that's a plant and make it be a meat and taste like meat and look like meat and cook like meat. And we know as chefs that, that doesn't necessarily transpose. When we look at things in terms of protein acquisition, tofu, tempeh, et cetera, that have been around for a long time and not transformed through ultra processing, but through processing, fermentation, et cetera, we know that those actually tend to be good for us, again, depending on the amounts consumed in terms of just ingesting soy protein. So, my short answer is, kind of caveat, whatever caveat eater would be, but you consume those plant-based meat alternatives at your own risk.
Thank you both very, very much. We have a training question. So Stephanie, I'm going to put this one to you first. If someone is in what they're considering hard training, should they stick to 3 meals, and what type of meal should they have closest to their workout, or any timing suggestions you might have?
So if somebody is engaging in hard training, and especially if this is happening for multiple days in a row, they have very high energy needs. It would probably be best for them to look beyond just 3 meals to meet those overall energy needs for the day, or else you would have to eat very large meals to meet overall energy needs to fuel that activity appropriately. So I would say the more active you are, the more we need to consider snack time, including recovery nutrition and or fueling up for that activity. So I think that can totally have a place in here. And I get asked all the time, oh, is it better to have 3 meals or 6 meals? There's no one right answer. It really depends on the person, their preferences, and their priorities. So if somebody is having, hard training days, especially day after day, they are constantly in fueling up and recovery mode. So with that said, I would look more towards that hard training day plate, where we see approximately half of the plate coming from those starchy foods, and about 25% each from our proteins and our fruits and vegetables. I would also look at making sure that we are getting in really good recovery nutrition, and recovery nutrition is not just protein. It is definitely carbohydrate as well. We are depleting our internal carbohydrate stores, glycogen, especially when we have longer duration and more intense activity. And so getting in protein and carbohydrates are going to be really important for refueling and getting you ready for the next day. Hopefully that answers that.
Yes, I would definitely say so. And Chef Dr. Mike, we're going to come to you. Do you believe that plate presentation and the overall dining experience can also positively impact the nutrition?
Yeah, it absolutely has a huge impact on health. And so, part of culinary medicine, and though we focus for today's talk, what we put on the plate, and particularly with an emphasis on what we put on our children's plate, certainly those softer edges, how, when, where, why, with whom we choose to dine, have huge impacts. And in fact, we're getting ready to launch some upper level courses at the University of Montana, our culinary medicine program. And one of them is culinary medicine and mindfulness, specifically looking at how these dining experiences, how we approach food, can impact our physiological and biological responses for health, or in some cases to our detriment. So absolutely, it's got to look good, get excited, have a happy frame of reference when you go in. As Stephanie was saying, delicious and nutritious should never be mutually exclusive.
Excellent. Well, there have been some questions coming in too about accessibility, and that sometimes, eating better than some of these ultra processed foods can also be limiting to some people who may not be able to afford organic vegetables and so forth, or living in food deserts. How might you suggest those who are working in those communities, living in those communities, increase their nutrition? Or are there different ways that can influence change in order to make vegetables and fruits more accessible? Would anyone like to take that?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in with that, because I think personally, in my experience, this is really where chefs can make a huge difference. And we kind of call this practical culinary medicine. So certainly, some of my kitchen experience have been working in restaurants that purviewed higher end, expensive ingredients, right? It was coming from the farm. It was fresh fish coming from the Chesapeake Bay. We had to use all bits of that because our ingredient base was expensive. And we all know that, kitchen costs are a big part of whether a restaurant is successful or not. And we can communicate and share some of those things with the home chef. They don't know about making stocks, right? They're paying some celebrity chef $15 a quart to get stock that should cost 6 cents, to make a gallon. But they don't know how to do that. And they don't know how to do it effectively. So we can share, save your trim, save the tops and tails, put it in the fridge, make a stock over the weekend. You buy those organic carrots and you get the greens, because that helps let you know how fresh they are. Do a pesto, do a gremolata, use those greens in the stock. Those sorts of things that we can share with the public at large, that we know as chefs and that we kind of don't even think about and take for granted. That makes a huge difference in somebody's budget. To give you an idea, anywhere from 30 to 50% of all the food purchased by the average US household winds up in a landfill somewhere. So tons of food in the home go to waste. We're the experts in stretching that, and taking it from fresh to soup to whatever. And when you can share those skills you have with your community, with your clients, et cetera, you're giving, you're teaching them to fish, as the saying goes. So sorry, Steph, that's one of my passion points. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think too, when we're talking about like accessibility, it's money, but it's time. It's time too. And so, something like if we think about that balanced plate, right? And half of the plate approximately is our fruits and veggies, a quarter of it is protein, and a quarter of it is starches. Many times people are eating more than 25% of their plate as proteins. That's going to be the most expensive component. And so you can automatically decrease your plate cost at home by moving perhaps to more of that 25% of the plate, which we know is probably going to be appropriate for you anyway. So that's only one way that you can reduce cost. Our starches don't have to be expensive, right? Brown rice, beans. Honestly, if you had white rice, sometimes it's okay. It's about the frequency and the cadence of this stuff too. It's totally fine. So breads, like it's totally possible to buy many simple, healthful, whole foods that don't have to take a lot of time to prepare. I think another thing too, whenever I'm working with people is like, let's be realistic. You want to cook, but are you gonna cook? Like, let's get those things in your kitchen that are gonna make it really quick and easy. So for example, instead of buying a whole tomato and just the obstacle of getting the knife out to cut it is gonna make you not eat it, maybe let's buy some cherry tomatoes. It's much easier just to grab a handful of those, right? Little things like that can actually make the difference because it doesn't count if we don't eat it. So I'm always trying to work with people when it comes to resource scarcity, both on money and time.
Well, great. Well, I know that I could talk to both of you for hours and hours, but we are coming up on the end of our time. I'm just going to come to each of you, and if you could leave us with either some final words or a final tip to the chefs and culinary students and CPSDA members who are tuning in. And Stephanie, you're on my screen, so if you would mind going first.
Yeah, I think to echo what Chef Dr. Mike said previously, like healthful and delicious can be the same. And I think for anybody interested in this field, in this area, and supporting health of those around you and beyond, we really need to embrace that and show people that it's possible. We know they make choices based on taste. And so let's make sure that our dishes are delicious and also reflect some of these healthful practices. And this includes choosing what's on the plate and trying to get those more nutritious foods, focusing on healthful preparations, and selling that flavor, right? Developing that flavor, right? Caramelization, herbs, all that good stuff, and making people really excited about it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And Chef Dr. Mike, your final thoughts or tips?
Yeah, I would echo what Stephanie said as well. And I think too, as culinary professionals, the more that you can learn about the connections between food and health, and the more you can communicate that to the public and your customers and consumers, I think that you'll reap a reward for that. Shortly after COVID started, a study came out and showed that about 85% of the US public was very concerned about changing their diet and wanting to eat in a more healthful manner. And there's so much confusion out there. Chefs are the interface, right? This is where people come and they interface with the food they eat. They look towards chefs to leaders for the reasons that Stephanie emphasized, which is, hey, we all want stuff to taste good. That brings us joy. That's how we're wired as human beings. And we look to the chefs to lead us in that area. So the more that chefs can come and bring this together, and we can all work together, I think we can create, not only more healthful, a more healthful society, but a happier society. And just looking at the temperature out there in general, I think a little joy all around is not such a bad idea.
Well, thank you. A perfect note to end on. Thank you so much to Stephanie. Thank you, Chef Dr. Mike. A huge virtual round of applause. We appreciate you taking the time to share your passion and your enthusiasm for nutrition with the chefs, culinary students, and food service professionals tuning in today. I could feel it through the screen. So thank you for bringing it today. For those of you tuning in, please be on the lookout for the survey that you'll receive shortly, which you'll need to complete in order to earn your 1 hour of ACF CEH. and that email will also include the recording of this session. Please register now for our upcoming webinars. You can join us on October 27th as we take a virtual trip to Hawaii for an amazing fish demo focusing on kampachi with Chef Robin Mai. And check out wearechefs.com to sign up for any of the other upcoming webinars this fall. We had a great time at ACF National Convention in Las Vegas this summer. Please visit acfchefs.org and click on the events tab to register now for ACF National Convention in New Orleans, July 17th through the 19th, 2023. So on behalf of the ACF National Office, thank you again to our association partners at CPSDA for supporting ACF education today. Thank you, of course, to University of Montana and the IMBOS Foundation, and a huge thanks to our guest speakers for this great learning opportunity. And thank you all for tuning in today. Have a happy Childhood Nutrition Day, everyone. See you next time.